So welcome to our budget hot take, especially to all of you who are watching us live on YouTube this afternoon.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for joining us. Very exciting. Rachel Reeves sat down, about an hour and a half ago or something, and we've been digesting the budget, and we're going to give our instant reaction.
That's right, live on YouTube, and then also pretty much straight away on our normal podcast feed. First Labour budget for 14 years, a historic moment, the first ever woman female chancellor to deliver a budget to a very packed house, and I thought she was authoritative. There weren't lots of jokes, but there was a lightness of touch. She was quite political. I mean, very political early on in her. I think compared to budgets I've seen in the past, it was a more political performance. But I would think she'll be pretty pleased with how it landed in the chamber. Look, you've done this, unlike me, to get through it without interruption, to get to the end and feel you've set out and then done what you intended to do in a very stressful situation. There must be a massive sense of relief.
Yeah, I mean, I was always very relieved at the end to have delivered it and without, as you say, something going wrong. And I thought it was an assured performance by her. I thought it was a little bit too political. And people would often accuse me of being a political chancellor, but I don't think you have to kind of lay the politics out there in a budget speech in the way she did. It sounded a bit like the last budget of a parliament rather than the first budget. But I don't think that should take away from the big decisions. In the end, what she's paid to do by all of us is to trust her judgment and make some big decisions. And there is no doubt that she made some big decisions today, that these are decisions that a Labour chancellor would make, that a Conservative chancellor wouldn't. And I think, therefore, she will be quite pleased at the end of it. But it's one of those budgets that I suspect the initial reaction will not be euphoric. And so she must sort of brace herself for some pretty tough headlines in the media over the next day or two, but she knows that's not really the test she's being held against. She's being the question is, has she launched this Labour government after the false starts of the last 3 months?
She sits down. There's immediately these massive Treasury documents, the Red Book, 170 pages, very long document by the Office of Budget Responsibility, supporting documents. You and I have not had any time to read any of this. So there'll be people now trying to find the hidden stuff in there, which they can reveal overnight. When we come back with our normal Thursday podcast, we'll be able to kind of reflect upon how this unfolds. But this is very much our first reaction. And I guess we should start off by saying lots of people who may be listening to this who didn't actually see the full budget speech like we did. So maybe we shouldn't assume that everybody knows what happened.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, people also will be able to listen to this later as well as listening to us live. And, it's not our job to read out the Chancellor's budget speech, but I think we can give some of the highlights. So what we think are kind of, I suppose, the most important points in the budget speech. So why don't we start with where she started, which was on the big forecasts. And these, of course, are not produced by her. They are produced by the Office for Budget Responsibility. And we might come back to this tomorrow to discuss the role of the OBR in this budget. I would say they've emerged at the end of the budget speech sort of with a score draw, in that they will have annoyed both the Conservatives and the Labour Party in what they've said, which is probably exactly the right place for them to be, because they went into the budget with Jeremy Hunt complaining, and they'll have come out of the budget with Rachel Reeves saying, well, it could have been a little bit more helpful. So let's start with what I think is actually one of the biggest stories of the budget, and it's ultimately an unknowable thing, which is the growth forecast for the economy, but she's accepted the OBR's growth forecast, and it's pretty flat. I mean, that to my mind is one of the big stories of this budget. They are not projecting that the British economy grows anything like the way it did in previous eras. And basically growth is at around 1.5% through the period. It's a little bit higher than was projected under the Conservatives earlier this year by the OBR. And it's a little bit higher in the first couple of years, and then it's a little bit lower than the Conservatives were supposed to oversee in the later part of this decade. But I think you can ignore that a little bit, because these are all, differences of a margin. The main story is Britain's growth is not getting substantially better. And that's a big challenge if you're the current government.
That's exactly right. If you think back 10, 20 years ago, 20 years ago, before the financial crisis, this would be a very, very anemic, weak forecast for growth. And as you said, it was pretty weak. The last Conservative budget had growth 2028 at 1.7%, which was is low. That's been revised down to 1.5% by the OBR. If you think about the Rachel Reeves Keir Starmer pledge to have the fastest growth rate in the G7, well, they'll have to assume that the rest of the G7 is growing pretty weakly by the end of the Parliament if they're going to have the fastest. I guess they will think to themselves, and this, come back to this in a moment, that, you know, hopefully the only way is up. I mean, hopefully if there's some upside in this budget, some upside surprise, growth not coming out as weakly as these forecasts say. The OBR say in the medium term, the measures, we'll come to that in a minute, might improve the growth performance of the economy, but they're giving no credit for anything the government is doing for growth performance in this Parliament. And you're completely right. Inflation comes down to target, but the growth numbers are weak.
So then let's move on. What was the next thing that caught your eye? There's the borrowing numbers, perhaps we should look at.
Well, so the borrowing numbers is a much more significant change than the growth numbers. The government said that they will meet the same fiscal rule as we've had in the past, balancing the current budget. They've now said, by the way, they're going to meet that by the third year of the forecast, you know, over time, rather than at the end of the Parliament. It's still a rolling forecast. They meet that. But they also said, and we've discussed this a lot in recent weeks, they've been preparing the ground for a different measure of net debt, financial debt, which includes financial assets and liabilities the governments hold, which gives them more room for manoeuvre, consistent with a falling debt ratio, to borrow for investment. And they've used up that room for manoeuvre. So they meet both of their fiscal rules, but they do so alongside a marked increase in borrowing. So borrowing, compared to the March budget, borrowing is up by 40 billion this year, and then by 28 billion, by 20 billion, by 21 billion, by 32 billion in 28-29. A lot more borrowing than before. As I said, still conditional with the new definition of net debt and the old definition excluding Bank of England held debt, both coming down. They are saying they're going to borrow to invest, and they're going to borrow to invest in quite a big way. It means that under the old plans, capital investment would have been falling. Now capital investment is staying at the same level as a percentage of the overall economy. And then the tax changes we'll come to at the moment are basically covering the extra spending. Actually, the extra spending is slightly more than the tax rises, the extra current spending. With that, so part of that borrowing rise is current spending as well as capital spending. But they're meeting the fiscal rules, but quite a big increase in borrowing. And the overall tax share in our economy continues to rise. Public spending now stabilizing in aggregate at a higher level than before the pandemic. We are not a 41% of GDP economy. We're now a 44% of GDP economy in spending terms, biggest tax burden for very many decades. That's the overall fiscal picture.
Yeah, I still think, you know, there's a kind of strange paradox at the heart of these forecasts and these numbers, which is, so growth disappointing, borrowing up quite a bit, taxes up a lot, as you say, you know, taxes now at a record high as a percentage of national income. And she said it, I think all credit to her, because quite often chancellors try and hide this. She actually said early on in her speech, this is a 40 billion pound tax rise, which is, you know, I think officially now the biggest tax rising budget of the modern era. And yet the spending is up. We'll come on and talk about this, but it's not actually as much as by quite as much as the big increase in taxes and the pretty big increase in borrowing would imply.
That's right.
And we need to kind of get into this is where we need to get into the forecast, and because something's going on there. I don't know whether the poorer growth performance is, which means lower tax revenues and various other impacts on the public finances, means that some, you know, she's basically lost some money in the forecast change.
I think I've got an answer, but should we just talk about the tax rises before we do the spending numbers? If you were on the bus on the way home and you've not watched this budget, you'd be thinking to yourself, look, fuel duty, I thought that was going to go up. It's not gone up. Alcohol duties are not going up. In fact, they're going down by 1p on a pint of beer. No rise in my income tax and my VAT in my national insurance. If I pay capital gains tax or I've got a big farm, I might have to pay a bit more. But other than that, it's not really going to affect me. Is that an accurate picture of the tax measures?
Well, I remember Nigel Lawson used to get very annoyed that he'd deliver these big reforming budgets as he saw it, and then everyone would focus on what happened to fags and booze and those sorts of things. Sort of cigarettes up, alcohol down. That old trick that it's quite a cheap way to get a good applause line in a budget, freezing or cutting beer duty, and made me beer champion of the year one year. But I think that the mistake, you're right. I think the person on the bus, although I guess they're paying a higher bus fare from next year, but the person on the bus probably doesn't see where the tax rises go. And that enables Rachel Reeves to say, I've met my promise and the promise we made in the Labour manifesto not to increase taxes on working people. But there is a very big £25 billion increase in employer national insurance, well trailed, but no one quite guessed exactly what she would do, which was to increase the headline tax rate by 1.2%. And then she essentially halved the threshold before which you start paying it as an employer on someone's salary. And although she compensated a bit for the smallest companies, that's a really big tax rise on the cost of employing people and should probably be put alongside the big increase in the minimum wage, which went up over 6% or will go up over 6%, she announced today. So if you're an employer, this is quite a substantial cost. And I think one of the calculations people will look at overnight is, for a kind of small firm, what's the burden, what's the cost of employing? I saw a number, I haven't had a chance to check whether it's accurate, but say you were paying someone part-time around £4,000 a year in a salary or in a wage, you didn't pay any employer's NICs before today. Now you're paying 15% on that. So this is going to fall on the wages, particularly of the lower paid. And where I said at the beginning, the OBR weren't being particularly helpful to Rachel Reeves, they say this will hit household incomes and that household income growth is reduced because of this very big increase in employer national insurance. And as we said on this podcast, ultimately all taxes fall on individuals. But it's a bit buried. You're right. It's not obvious if you're sitting on that bus.
There was a Delphic phrase she used in her speech when she announced this huge. This is, in tax raising terms, this is a bigger budget than we've seen for many decades, bigger than 2010, bigger than 1997. And what is unusual is that most of the other tax rises are quite small. What she's done on CGT, inheritance tax, stamp duty, all quite small. The employer's one is huge.
We should just say, shouldn't we?
Come on.
Yeah. On CGT, I think she didn't do as much as people expected, this capital gains tax. That only went up to 24% from 20%. On inheritance tax, she closed some of these allowances for farmland, family businesses and pensions. I think the farmland one is going to actually come back and be quite a big issue because a lot of farms are going to be affected by that. But it's also being abused by people who just buy up farmland in order to avoid inheritance tax. And there were a couple other things, like a couple of percent on stamp duty for second homes, and the VAT on private school fees went ahead, and the non-DOMS regime was abolished. So I thought on the enterprise package, it probably wasn't as bad as it might have been. I thought a lot of it was announced, a lot of it was in the Labour manifesto. But I think if you were in the private equity industry, if you were an entrepreneur, some of the WhatsApp groups I'm on, they're all like, actually, that could have been a lot worse.
But the employer's national insurance rise is bigger than expected. £25 billion a year by the end of the period. In her speech, she said, the impact will be felt beyond businesses, as the OBR has set out today. And that rather Delphically is referring to the OBR saying in their forecast that actually a substantial part of the employer's national insurance rise will be passed onto real wages, i.e. that people will see lower wages in their pay packets as a result of the employer national insurance tax rise goes up, and the employer then effectively over time gives smaller pay rises to compensate for that. And that was one of the two things which are in there which were quite uncomfortable from the OBR, aside from the fact the OBR doesn't give any credit for any of the improvements in growth that she's hoping for. One is that working people will pay in their wages for the employer's national insurance tax rise. And then secondly, they say that the consequence of that of that marked increase in public borrowing is that interest rates, mortgage interest rates, because of interest rates set by the Bank of England, will be higher than they otherwise would, that you can only meet the inflation with that extra borrowing by slightly higher interest rates. You see a little bit of that in the financial markets today, but this is more the OBR looking forward. They've revised upwards their projections of the interest rates the Bank of England will set. So whether it's in your mortgage rates or whether it's in your wages, people will feel the impact of this. The politics is, will they see it and connect it to what Rachel Reeves has done in a way they did very directly with the Liz Truss budget. But as we've said on this podcast, there's no way to increase taxes by £40 billion and for it not to be felt by people. But they can say that their manifesto pledges have been kept to. And the other thing which we should just mention, because there was a lot of speculation about whether she would extend the freezing of personal allowances introduced by Rishi Sunak beyond the end of the forecast period for another couple of years. Extending the personal allowance would not mean an increase in rates, but it would absolutely be an increase in the tax you would pay in your pay packet. And if there was a rabbit in this budget, this was probably it. She gave the impression she might be about to do it and then said she wasn't going to do it because that would be breaking her promise to working people in their pay packets on tax. So she's ended the freezing of personal allowances at the end of the period that the Conservatives had set them as frozen. And that is a new announcement, and maybe it's logical, but there was quite a lot of expectation, I think, in the newspapers that she was going to extend that personal allowance freeze. Anything else we should say on tax? Something quick on spending?
Well, she did also she froze fuel duty, we should say. Probably, I can imagine the Treasury saying to her, as they used to say to me, oh, that's a ridiculous thing to do, but I don't think she had much option. And she didn't do anything on the winter fuel payment. She's continuing with the policy already announced. So there was no course correction on that, we should just say.
Let's come back to how this is going to unfold in a second. Just on spending, as I said, increase in capital investment. Also, an increase.
Well, they're just keeping it in order to keep it where it is at the moment as a percentage of the economy. Exactly. So it's not transformative.
It's quite modest. And she spent a lot of the speech announcing quite minor spending places like HS2 going to Euston without announcing anything. It seemed to me particularly mega and big. There were quite a lot of big numbers for aerospace, but it wasn't all clear what this money was going to be spent on. On the current spending, though, what is really
your friend Ed Miliband got a few billions for his various energy projects.
Well, look, and the big she said she had guardrails for her capital spending, one of which was making sure the money is well spent and properly, transparently spent with kind of efficiency and all those kind of things. And that will be an important test that she has to pass. Interesting, on the current spending side, there was a very big increase for the National Health Service. But more generally, there was a big increase in current public spending for the coming year, and then almost no increases. So it was like, 3/4 of it in the first year, and then very small increases in the latter years. And the overall numbers were current spending rising, over the next 3-4 years, 1.5% a year, with capital spending 1.7% a year. That is lower than the Institute for Fiscal Studies said you would need. They said you would need 2% if you were going to stop cuts in individual budgets for those unprotected departments outside health and education. And they've not done 2, they've done 1.5. So it's both tight on public spending and quite front end loaded. It's very much first year orientated. She said she set the envelope for the spending review because she's doing the second and the third years in her spending review next year. She doesn't want, she says, to come back and do another budget in the spring. But I have to say, if there was any upside on growth, you would definitely want, I would say, look, of course, this is a political choice, because you might say if there's any upside on growth, use it to cut taxes. But I think for a Labour Chancellor, 1.5% real overall for current spending is painfully tight. And when you start thinking as the years go on about what does this actually mean for teachers' pay, for house building, for local government services, for policing, I mean, there is going to be an ongoing debate about whether this is really the end of austerity as felt by the deliverers of public services.
Well, the interesting thing is she's actually setting up a return to austerity in about 2 years' time, unless she does something in some subsequent event, because she's put a huge amount of money, particularly into the NHS. And to be fair to her, I think we've discussed that fixing the NHS is one of the absolute central priorities.
And starting right now. So she's definitely getting on with it.
Yeah, I think the question is going to be, can you possibly spend that money well if you chuck it at the NHS with such a short period of notice, and it's only time limited? So after 2 years, it kind of drops away. And then really spending is pretty flat after that, and that will feel like austerity. So, and in other government departments, because overall spending is only rising, as you say, by 1.5%. So to put that in context, Jeremy Hunt had spending going up by 1%. So it's not that much more. In other government departments, we haven't seen all this, but in local government, in the Department of the Environment, in the Home Office, is this going to feel like here comes the cash after years of Tory austerity or parsimony? I don't think it is going to feel like that. They've basically put all of their spending chips, as far as I can see, on the NHS, or most of the spending chips on the NHS.
Let's just talk first of all about the next few days. You can be pretty clear that going into tomorrow, people will be saying the OBR says people will pay for the employers' national insurance and the living standards, that the growth numbers are not strong, is this a break of the manifesto pledges, that the public spending settlements are going to be quite tight. I just wonder, as the days go on, there might be also a focus on, she's said she's going to carry on with getting the savings from the welfare reforms announced by the last government, barely mentioned in the budget speech, but it was there. That could turn out to be quite controversial. As you said, she's avoided a second hit to pensioners. You wouldn't say there's going to be a pensioners double whammy, but if they're thinking to themselves in the Treasury, we've got off with the winter fuel allowance cut, which is in the fiscal tables today, in the policy decisions table. I mean, the thing which we know is it's only when things get colder and you start to get those kind of bouts of flu and excess deaths in the winter that the winter fuel allowance issue is going to bite. So it doesn't feel to me as though that is going to go away. I wonder what else might open up over the next few days in terms of how the analysts and the politicos focus on stuff.
Yeah, we should say, by the way, we're also getting questions in while we're doing this, and we will pick up on a couple of those as we answer, because we've actually had a good question, which is one from Matthew asking, with all this extra money, he's a current civil servant. We better not reveal. Well, we don't know who he is. But anyway, thank you, Matthew, for emailing in. He says, given what we know about the cogs in government, how long they take to term, and your experience of government, do you think the money will result in improvements in the public services? Will we see them quickly? Although we also had someone, Michelle, saying, finally, the NHS and education back. This ain't Osborne's austerity. So I think that's going to be one of the kind of key tests, isn't it? Is this money going to be spent in a way that is going to, be able to make sure that people see measurable improvements in their experience of the NHS? So there are not the waiting lists are coming down. They feel they can get a GP appointment. And I think, the big kind of, obvious thing in this budget, which is a massive tax rise that will be reported in every newspaper tomorrow, which government ministers will say isn't a tax rise on working people, but other people like the OBR will say, yes, it is. If that leads to an improvement in public services, then, Labour will say, job done. That's what Labour governments are for. Taxes go up and spending go up. But if it doesn't, and if growth remains anemic, this sets up a really difficult parliament It's a tax-raising Labour government that can't deliver improvements in public services or in growth.
I think that's completely right. You need people to feel better off, and the growth numbers and the living standard numbers are not fabulous in these forecasts, so they'll be hoping for improvement. You will need people to feel that the public services they use are improving, and that can't happen simply in 1 year. And throwing loads of money at it in year one, I would think that they'll be looking to smooth that over the 3 years, and they'll have to come back, I think, and look at these numbers again for departmental spending. Very hard though to do another.
But what were they doing?
Rise.
Well, they can't do another big tax rise. You're about to say, aren't you?
No,
Sorry,
exactly.
I interrupted you. You're about to make exactly the point.
I was about to say that. I think if you do a tax rise on this scale at the beginning of a parliament, you've done your big thing on tax. Doesn't mean you can't do a bit here or there, but they've done it now. So she now, as Chancellor, needs growth to deliver on living standards and the resources across public services. And, the OBR at the moment is being very, very cautious on that. So we're going to be back to every quarter when the growth numbers are being announced, wondering, is growth going to improve and deliver for this Labour Treasury? And then, of course, all that focus on how the money is spent, and in particular, that capital money is spent, is it going to be delivering a strengthening of growth? I thought she did her summary of her growth measures, her 7-point plan, in a pretty short and cursory way. We're going to need more detail if we're going to be persuaded that's really going to deliver on growth.
I didn't hear anything really new there. I mean, chancellors past, and there have been quite a few chancellors in recent years, have also listed the same kind of transport projects. She talked about the Oxford to Cambridge railway line, the Transpennine line. I remember announcing that over a decade ago. And the HS2 to Euston is just something that was supposed to happen in the first place, but was then in doubt. Good to have money on science and R&D, but nothing transformative. Good to have announcements on energy, as we're talking about, but again, nothing transformative. I don't think you hear like this is a whole new way of trying to get growth into the British economy, and that growth is quite anemic. So that remains something for the government to do, and they haven't pulled obvious tax or levers to do that. Quite the opposite. Some of the enterprise taxes went up, although not as much as we said people thought they might, and she hasn't dolloped the money there. It's gone into schools, school buildings, and above all into the NHS.
We've got another question from another George, actually. This is kind of slightly more kind of insider question. He says, when I was watching the budget, every time the camera cut to Rishi Sunak, he was on his phone writing or faffing with papers. When he took to his feet, he was being handed papers and notes. He saw them being passed down the row behind, and even included a brown envelope. What was he doing during his speech? And how do leaders of the opposition prepare to respond? Do you get an advanced copy of the budget speech, or are you making it up on the fly in the chamber?
Well, the answer is you're making it up on the fly in the chamber. I used to respond as Shadow Chancellor, and you of course, were Shadow Chancellor to the autumn statement, which is not unlike a budget, but the leader of the opposition does the budget. And you don't get any advance warning at all, although, of course, you can read the newspapers like everyone else, and lots of this budget appeared before Budget Day. What you're really looking for is, and what he's trying to get sent into him in the chamber, what I thought was actually a very strong performance. It's a sort of irony that Rishi Sunak, that was his last ever performance from the dispatch box as a frontline politician, because there will be a new Tory party leader by next week. It was a really strong performance, and he had a lot of fight in him, not someone who was sort of going out on a whimper. But he was trying to get those OBR numbers, which the Chancellor doesn't read out, on what's happening, the record tax burden, or, what's happening to public inflation and interest rates, which you mentioned, both of which are higher as a result of budget measures. So he was trying to get hold of those things, or people were messaging about them. I think that's a kind of, isn't there, which, we've got all tomorrow to get into this in our podcast. I think if you kind of take a step back, quite a lot of budgets come and go, and even the people who deliver the budgets struggle to remember what's in them. But I very much remember my first budget. in 2010. And I think Rachel Reeves will, of course, however long she's Chancellor, remember this, not just because it's the great occasion of delivering your first budget and the first budget by a female Chancellor, but because she's made a really big decision. She's decided to gamble on a big tax rise to try and get the NHS improving. She's taken some risks with borrowing, and she hopes that people will see the improvement in their public services, particularly the NHS. She thinks it's worth doubling down on the NHS versus other departments, and she can ride the claim that there's going to feel like austerity in some other parts of the public services. And then above all, it's a gamble on growth, because she's left herself very low margins for error. The headroom on her fiscal rules, even if they have been fiddled a bit to be more generous, to allow her to borrow more, they're very small margins at the beginning of a parliament.
That is right.
And if growth turns against her, if growth is more anemic, if the view of the OBR and others is that productivity is, not improving in the UK, then she's going to find herself in really hot water in the middle of the Parliament.
I think that's right. This is not going to be one of those budgets where people say on day one, it's fabulous, and then after a couple of days, they start to unpick it. I think it will be, although it didn't hit people so hard on their fuel or on their income tax, that scale of that employer national insurance rise means it's going to be seen as a big taxing budget. But I don't think it's also going to be one of those budgets which kind of over 2 or 3 days, people start to say, isn't it fabulous? Because sometimes budgets are underestimated and improve in a day or two. This is going to be one of those budgets where we're going to judge it in 1, 2, 3 years' time. You can say decisively, she's decided, on the one hand, not to be Alistair Darling or Roy Jenkins. She's not being a Labour Chancellor who is attempting to simply be austere and a bit Labour. Nor has she decided to be George Osborne. She doesn't want to be the heir to you. This was not a 2010 strategy. It's closer to Gordon Brown, 97, 98 or 2001. But of course, the thing we had was we had an economy which continued to strengthen and to strengthen on the upside. It did better than we expected, and it was started in a much stronger position. And so on the one hand, she's gone for big spending, borrowing for investment, investing in public services, but with an economy which is fragile. And if that economy gets better and people feel it, it will be seen as a winning budget. But if the economy falters and people feel squeezed and the tax revenues don't come in, she's not going to be coming back a second time in this Parliament with Rachel Reeves' massive tax rise too. And at that moment, as you said, it starts to feel like she is being pushed into a much tighter position on public spending. So we won't know about this budget for 1 or 2 years. I think what you'll definitely say is it was big and bold and historic. And she'll end the day feeling she's given it her best shot. Yeah,
it's a kind of cross your fingers and hope for the best budget. But they quite often are, having done that job. I thought it was a kind of pretty classic Labour. It was not the budget advertised ahead of the general election, which is obviously what the Tories were saying, but it's what you would expect if you had a Labour government. Big tax rises, borrowing up, spending up. I thought it didn't have some new Labour elements of cuts for enterprise. But as you say, it's all now. It's if you think about it, Keir Starmer said the central mission of this government is to get growth in the economy, and the day after the budget, that mission is as important for the political fortunes of the government as it is for the fortunes of the country as a whole.
And that's true. And the other things which we've talked about in recent weeks, like the 2-child poverty policy, the 2-child cap on payments, or the winter fuel allowance, if the economy improves and the public finances improve, there'll be things she'll be able to do to mitigate, because those issues aren't going away. But if the economy doesn't improve, they'll continue to be very, very complicated for her. Look, that is all for this special live episode of Political Currency.
It's always good on Budget Day to be facing you on a TV screen, doing a podcast together rather than clashing across the dispatch box in the House of Commons.
Look, it's quite nostalgic because, of course, in the old days, we used to do live TV. You and I live in the House of Commons. And then on our podcast, it's not quite live. I'm now used to doing live TV in the mornings on Good Morning Britain. This is you and I live and direct via YouTube as well as our podcast. If this is the first time you've seen our show, then you can tune in tomorrow, and we're going to talk about Budget Day 2, but also we'll look around the world at a couple of other things which we think are probably as significant politically, not just for the world, but also for Britain and the prospects of this Labour government, as what Rachel Reeves has announced today.
Yeah, in fact, and have quite a big impact on the economy, including here in Britain. We'll take a look, for example, at the US election with only a few days left to go. So you can see all that. You can also watch clips on our YouTube, and they will pop up on our socials. And we will be back in the studio tomorrow when we've had a chance to get into the nitty-gritty of the budget and unpick some of the themes that we've been discussing in the last half hour or so.
Very good. Hope you enjoyed it. See you tomorrow.
See you then.